Welcome to the Revolution Church podcast.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Revolution. Hopefully you found everything okay. So today, one of the things I'm going to talk about, well, let's do an intro. Let's do an intro. Let's talk about this week, a monologue while we're waiting for folks to show up. So here it is. Here's a monologue. Boop, 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 boop. Don't forget to like and subscribe, folks. I appreciate that. Also, what is the other thing? Oh, so this week, I've had a lot of interesting conversations about politics and things like that. And I shared on my Facebook, what's going on in the what's happening in Gaza a little bit, and I shared that photo that really moved me, that really woke me up and caused me, felt like more passionately needed to speak out even more. And I shared it on Facebook, and Facebook's still kind of like the Wild West. It's it's wild. And I was surprised. Some folks, I said, I think we should have an arms embargo at this point. And some of my conservative brothers and sisters pushed back a little bit on me. And I'll give you two reasons why that surprises me. Is one, I'm just so used to my conservative brothers and sisters, Republicans being small government. And our government just gave $20 billion to Israel for weapons. And I know that Bernie Sanders right now is trying to reverse that, which I think is fantastic. But it was just that they were defending that, and then that they were that when Christians defend war has just never made sense to me. Because I've studied Christianity for so long, and scholarship and history and things like that. I mean, I think it was like the first 100 years of Christianity, maybe even more. It was considered a nonviolent religion, and especially with the call to be kind to your enemies, restore your enemies, love your enemies. I ended up just I made the right decision. Because it's easy to get angry on social media. I think we all do it, and we all might say things we regret. I've done it before. Gratefully, I have good friends who go like, "Hey, want to rethink that?" Before it goes viral. So I just limited the discussion, and I don't like to limit discussions, but when it starts to get nasty, and you get people who are just kind of towing a line, it gets tough. But I am still really hoping for peace and praying for peace. And, it's never too late to do the right thing. It's never too late to speak out and encourage others to do that. And I think in an election year where our voices might matter a little bit more than usual, And so I hope we can kind of focus at these candidates and say, we don't want to see this type of killing going on in this world, and we definitely don't want to be a part of it. So there's something to think about. I just wanted to cover that first because that's, I think, very heavy. And we are going to be talking about the Apostle Paul today. Shocker, I know. But we're also going to be kind of talking about his work and what it means and the time it was written. And I'm going to refer to a book that I hadn't read in years. And so we're going to get through that. But before that, I grabbed this book. For some reason, this book I had grabbed, gosh, I don't think I'd opened it for 20 years, maybe longer, actually. But this guy had done a series of books that I really liked. But on the side note, I guess the last time I got it was around this time I was visiting. I used to do this thing called Life Fest, this festival in Wisconsin, and speak there every year. And so I was a grace guy, always talking about grace, and trying to get everybody else, everybody else on board with grace. And I talked a ton about grace, and I still do. And I would always, it was always, people were always like a little bit nervous about it. But there were some people who really caught it, like a core group of people that always were like, oh, we love this. And so I would end up staying with friends when I would go to this festival. A lot of festivals I would stay at a hotel or a camp or something. But I got to know a lot of people in Wisconsin for a while. And my friend got a tattoo of this one-winged bird, and the wings on the bird represented law and grace. And he had the law wing like mostly cut off, and it said beautifully unfair. And I guess they went to this really big church, this church that put on Life Fest. And I guess that word got back to the pastor. And I think stories like this are always interesting. And so he ended up bringing it up in a sermon. He's like, a one-winged bird, it just flies in circles, and goes through this whole thing. So of course we all hear this, all our buddies hear about this, and our friend Andrew got this tattoo, and they're all of a sudden there's this fuss about it. So I said, Andrew, I said, do you have the drawing of that? And he goes, yeah. And so all of us, like 3 or 4 of us, decided all to get together and get this tattoo. And this I found in the book. This was the tattoo. So beautifully unfair. And I had mine done in Green Bay Packers colors, and then the flower was actually Viking colors, because I thought that would be funny too, because like grace to your enemies. So I have that tattoo, and so a bunch of us like got this and took it to our tattoo artists in our own town. And so I got mine by Phil Colvin in Atlanta, and we all took it and was like, we want this tattoo. And so the pastor made fun of it, but also helped us all want to stick together with this. So anyhow, I thought that was kind of cool to find that and come upon that. I love tattoos, and I love stories, and I love standing up for grace. So the book, it's so funny because I was preparing a sermon. I was like, oh, there's that book I have, and it's this book right here. It's called What Paul Meant, by Gary Willis, who's a Catholic writer. He also wrote a book called What Jesus Meant and What the Gospels Meant. I have all 3. I remember reading all 3 a very long time ago, and I loved them all. And so there was something about Paul that I was questioning. I was like, that book was really easy to read. I bet you it's somewhere in there really quick. And I found what I was looking for as I was preparing my talk. And then I made that video on Instagram and said, hey, everybody, we're getting ready to do, and for Facebook was like, we're going to do this sermon on Paul's history. And I was like, that wasn't really the talk I was planning on giving, but I guess that's what I want to do, because I'm talking about it on this video. I'm talking more about some of the concepts in this book than I am my sermon. And so I was like, I'm going to rewrite this thing. So I sat down yesterday to rewrite it, and then I realized they both kind of go together and in an interesting way. So that's what we're going to talk about today. If you have questions or comments, I don't see any comments coming up, so hopefully you can hear me. But good morning, by the way. Greet your neighbor. This is the day the Lord has made. I will rejoice and be glad in it. I always remember hearing that when I was going to church as a kid. But we're going to talk a little bit about this book. I'm going to recommend this book because if you know anything about my work, I'm always trying to get people to re-examine Paul. Paul has often been used as a way of dividing people, which is ironic because Paul's the main message, and the message that really stuck out for me from Paul's work is grace, and grace is reunion. And so a lot of people have used Paul as legalism and things like that, and there's a few different reasons why that is, and we'll look at that. But I want to recommend this book, and I'm going to read from it here so you guys can hear a little bit about it. And it's an easy read. Like I was surprised. I just started reading it again the other day, and I got more than halfway through it in like just a couple hours. And if I can do that, you could probably read the book within like a day easily, because I got the old dyslexia. the old, my dyslexia is a weird form of dyslexia, but it's still, you know, I'm not a speed reader. But also when you read philosophy books, other books can seem like you're reading children's books because philosophy books are so dense. And you're like, I can only read one page today. But listen to this. This is what Gary Willis has to say about the Pauline writings. And this is interesting, and I think it's important for us all to know. Before I start reading, don't forget to like and subscribe and turn on those notifications. Yeah, so there you go. That helps us a lot. 13 letters are attributed to Paul in the New Testament, and for centuries they were all accepted as his. But modern scholarship has reached a consensus that some were definitely not written by him, and others are dubious authenticity. Only 7 now are accepted as certainly by him. These 7 are in the probable order of composition are. So this is interesting, the order of this is, as well, because I always thought Galatians was first. But Gary disagrees. See, we can learn here at Revolution. He says, 1 Thessalonians is the first official Pauline letter, followed by, my favorite, Galatians, then Philippians, then Philemon, first letter of Corinthians, and then the second letter of Corinthians, which he feels that are about 3 or 4 different books put together in 2 Corinthians. A couple different letters of Corinthians were kind of edited together. And then the letter to Romans. So he says these are the genuine Pauline letters. Now I'm going to go through what he talks about these other letters real quick as well, just so we kind of have an idea of what he's saying here. Now, of course, that's radical information if you grew up being told that the Bible was just like handed down by God, like, here you go. But when you realize it's just a collection of writings and how it was put together over time, you understand how some things just got in there that way they did. And it's great. You can look up the history of the canon. I always recommend doing that, looking how the Bible became as a book. Because before it was just scrolls. You know, when Paul is talking about the Gospels, or not Gospels, when Paul is talking about the Word and the Bible and things like that, when he's talking about the Scripture, he's talking about, you know, the Bible, the Old Testament. There was no Old Testament to him. So when he's talking about the Scriptures, that's what he's talking about. He's talking about, you know, the Torah. So that's one thing to always keep in mind as well. So it goes on to say the 2 letters seem to be written by followers of Paul, because that's what everybody tries to say, that when a letter isn't written by Paul, they go, oh, this is followers and it was cool, it was kosher, everybody could do that. But 2 letters seem to be written by the followers of Paul, who had profound understanding of what could be made of his teaching, and that is Colossians and Ephesians. And I really like Ephesians a lot. Colossians, I feel like, yeah, I can see how that might not be 100% Paul. There's some things in there with maybe some hierarchy stuff that Paul seemed to be constantly trying to take down and say, hey, we're all equal. No one's above anyone else. But yeah, I like Ephesians. Ephesians 2:8-9 is one of my favorite verses. So I guess kudos to the followers of Paul. One letter seems clumsy restatement of a genuine one, and they said that's 2 Thessalonians, which is interesting because he says, you know, First Thessalonians is definitely Paul, but he says 2 Thessalonians is kind of a clumsy reworking of the Apostle Paul. So that's also, I find, extremely interesting. And I recommend you guys go look at this stuff and research this stuff as well, because, you know, scholars aren't always 100% agreeing on things. But it's interesting to see what scholars think, and really to see what the majority of scholars think. I've never been a fan of apologetics, because I feel like apologetics is just like trying to make everything fit, you know, and it's like taking this library and like, we're going to make everything fit perfectly with an old concept because we want to keep that old concept true. But he goes, these 3 letters are written, the next one, these later letters are written in circumstance and from a standpoint clearly not Paul, which I'll agree. I think they would be better known as reactionary Paul, someone who's maybe trying to undo the work of the Apostle Paul. And that is the pastoral epistles, Titus and 1 Timothy and 2 Timothy. It's like a different person is writing that. Hello, Michael. But yeah, so it's like another person is writing this, and all of a sudden this hierarchy gets set up. And these letters were probably written very much after the life of Paul. So he goes on to say about this book, he goes, for the understanding of what Paul meant, one must rely on the letters accepted by almost all scholars as authentic. This book will use only those 7 letters. And what's incredible about looking at Paul's life too is, Luke and Acts were written around at the same time. Almost, I think they were one book together, if memory serves me correct. And in this letter, in this book, he says, let's not look at the transfiguration. It's told 3 times in the book of Acts, Paul's road to Damascus. And he goes, but this is written probably 30 years later, 30 years after Paul's died. And the stories are different. Like one is there's a big light that nobody sees but Paul, and another one, everybody sees the light and hears a voice, and then another one, I think nobody hears the voice. They change in just the same book. And he goes, let's listen to what Paul says. Paul doesn't seem to just see, Paul seems to believe that he had a real experience with Christ, like a real saw Christ, not just a light that we often say and hear about. But when you look at Paul's explanations in his own words, and he talks about the likelihood of Paul not really being able to violently persecute Christians, which I always thought Paul was really persecuting them, but he was just saying, the relationship between Rome and the Jewish religion was just always kind of let's just, try to keep it peaceful. So he's saying how unlikely that is. But if you read Paul's letters, and when Paul says how I devastated them and things like that, it could be similar of like when Paul writes Galatians and he rebukes people. And when Paul can often devastate people with his words and with his debate. So that also could be a thing. But it's worth looking at and it's worth talking about. So that's why I'm putting it out there. Thinking critically about the Bible is not a bad thing. It's really actually a good thing. And I think that, for me, would be more of a productive way of doing deconstruction, is when we really go in and look for the authentic. And, what are scholars saying? What is this? And maybe the religion that we grew up in was, not made to hurt us. Technically, it was probably by people who really meant well, but weren't educated enough or didn't understand the words enough, or were afraid to say some of these things, because in some denominations saying, well, this is not a genuine Pauline letter, you're out of the denomination, you lose your job. So there's often that happens in the church, believe it or not. Sometimes people don't take stands and things like this because they're afraid of what's going to happen to their life work and to the denomination, what they will do to them. Sorry, this is already 17 minutes in. Oh. So I thought that was worth sharing. And the other thing, and I've said this before quite a few times, so I read this and I just felt like it kind of confirmed some of my thoughts on Paul, and I wanted to share that with you as well. It says here, where did I put my, I'm going to have to leave the camera in a second, but we'll wait for a second. It says, Paul is closer to the night than any other 3 Gospels that quote Jesus' words. The Gospels, for that matter, differ from each other in the details of what was said, as well as from Paul's account. But his stands first in the tradition and the nearest to the source. And so he's what the author here is kind of arguing is we need to take Paul's words seriously. And when he talks about Jesus, and we often think, well, he doesn't really talk about his life and what he did, but he does talk about teachings. And he's saying, like, these teachings might be even more clear than the gospel, because the Gospels are as early. Gospels are probably anywhere from 30 to 65 years, 40 to 60 years post-Jesus' life. Until then they were probably passed down in stories. There may have been other Gospels written that we didn't get. Of course, there's other Gospels that we hear about, but usually scholars ignore them as not being authentic. But the interesting thing about that, now what I really like here though, is Gary, Mr. Willis, what you talking about, Willis? Goes on to say this. He goes, this is the real point. Those who say that Paul was an alien spirit superimposed on that of a loving Jesus, do not see they both taught the same message of love. So often people say, I don't really like Paul. I can't stand Paul. He doesn't preach the same message. And then, Mr. Willis goes through this and starts talking about the different verses that you can line up with Paul's teachings and the teachings of Christ, which are really interesting. I have a pastor friend of mine that's, talking to him. He's like, man, I can't believe you got me reading Paul again and thinking about Paul again. He drives me crazy, but now I'm back. And that excites me when I hear people like responding well to the Apostle Paul, because the Apostle Paul's writings changed my life. I had read the Gospels before, but it was really when I felt desperate and felt so much legalism and felt so much judgment over my life, is that I was open to reading Paul. And when I started to read Paul, I really started to understand grace more. And it encourages me to think that Paul had something that was a little bit closer to the life of Christ, and how Paul walked with the disciples, how a lot of people who Paul worked with knew Jesus personally. I mean, so those things are all really interesting and worth taking into account. He was arguing with guys who worked with Jesus. But it goes on, it says all these different verses. He says, Jesus told his followers to love their enemies. So did Paul. I'm just going to jump through this. Jesus said, judge not lest you be judged. So did Paul. Paul said, in convincing others, you condemn yourself, since you are guilty of the condemnation. So did Paul. And who are you to judge brothers? Jesus said that as well. So like Jesus, he said, take no revenge. Jesus said not to resist those who are wrong like you. And Paul directed others to submit to wrong rather than to take people to court. The gospel rescue comes from the Jews, and Paul from Zion, and the rescue and the revelation of God's miracles and the rescues for who believers, the first of them being Greek. So anyway, there's so much that lines up within these genuine letters of Paul and the teachings of Christ. And he goes on to say this. He goes, I'm not saying that Paul had specific words of Jesus in any mind for all these similarities, but he surely had grasped the key to what Jesus taught during his life on earth. Most would agree that the point of the Sermon on the Mount and of the golden rule of the frequent commands to love unstingily was deeply understood by a man who could write this. And he goes into the 1 Corinthians 13, and that's the love chapter. It's usually what we hear at weddings and things like that, where I speak any language and any things, without love, I'm nothing, and then he goes on to the famous one, 7 through, love is patient and kind. It does not envy others or brag of itself. It's not swollen with itself. It is not wayward or grasping. It does not flare with anger, nor harbor grudges. It takes no joy in evil, but delights in truth. It keeps all confidence, all trust, all hope, endures. Love will never go out of existence. Prophecy will fail in time, language too, and knowledge as well. For we know things only partially, or prophecy partially, and when we totally know, the parts will vanish. It's like what I spoke as a child, I knew as a child, and thought as a child, argued as a child, which I feel like a lot of us, we're really good at arguing like children, especially online, which now I'm grown up. I put aside in the same way. We see things in murky reflections now, but we shall see them full face when what I have known part of I now know fully. Just as I am known for the presence, then the three things matter: believing, hoping, and love, but supreme is loving. I like in other versions where it says three things remain: faith, hope, and love, and the greatest of these is love. And the last comment he puts here, and we'll give Gary a break, is, does that sound like a man with what Nietzsche called a genius of hatred? That was Nietzsche's opinion of the Apostle Paul. But when we are able to have a perspective that some of these folks hadn't had, even people who were putting together the canon and things like that, it's really great. And we should be able to grow and evolve and understand these things better. I think sometimes we become too devoted to tradition, and often too devoted to even some of us aren't big context people, but sometimes not knowing context, we don't know what scripture is and what is context. The idea of marriage at that time was more about property, and if the person could have children and things like that. It's not how we do it today. And so often we'll hear preachers preaching just basically Middle Eastern religious tradition rather than taking the Bible in for what it can mean for us today and working it within our own traditions in this life. So that often happens. Okay, what I realized is I left one of my books right over here. So I'm going to grab my book. I won't be gone long. Be nice to each other. I'm back. All right, folks. So this is what we're going to do is we're going to look at some of those. We're just going to look at Romans. Romans is an interesting book. Paul was definitely trying to make an impression with this book. One of the reasons we probably have Romans is that Paul had a lot of scribes. And this book was very particular to him, and he was trying to help Jewish Christians, and Jews were being pushed out of Rome because of the confusion between Jewish Christians and and just Jews and Jewish Christians. And so there were some things going on. And so strangely enough, the Gentiles, Christians, were more accepted within that community. And so he's talking a little bit about that there as well. But he felt this was such an important book that he had his scribes write out many, many, many copies of the book of Romans and would have this pass out to a lot of different people in that community. So it was like we were probably going to get this one because there were so many copies that Paul had his scribes do. And remember, we didn't have a printing press then, so back then when you wanted to write something, you had to have somebody write it over and over and over again, and then you had to have somebody check it to make sure it was correct and all these things. So, but that's all they knew. So I'm going to start with Romans 12. And are we going to stay in Romans? I'm trying to think because I didn't put anything down here. But Romans 12. Romans is a really interesting book. Obviously, Romans 1 has been used to separate and divide people often, but when you really read it within its context, it becomes a different thing as well. That's the thing, is we kind of pick and choose which context we're going to be with at the time as well. So we always have to, look with a critical eye. So here we go. In Romans 12:9, let love be genuine. Hate what is evil. Hold fast to what is good. Love one another with mutual affection. Outdo one another in showing honor. So this is really Paul building on the message of Christ. This is literally Jesus taught us to, two most important commandments. Love God with all your heart. Equally as important, love your neighbor as yourself. I mean, these are very big things in the faith of Christianity. And so when we're looking at these genuine Pauline letters, we're probably getting a really good glimpse of the teachings of Jesus and what the apostles sat down and talked about with one another and what the earliest followers of Jesus were talking about. Do not lag in zeal. Be ardent in spirit. Serve the Lord. Rejoice in hope. Be patient in suffering. That's a tough one. My patience is starting to wear out a little bit, I'll be honest with you. Preserve in prayer. Contribute to the needs of the saints. Extend hospitality to strangers. People always talk about Sodom and Gomorrah, but if you read later in the Old Testament, you'll see that Sodom and Gomorrah was actually destroyed because how it treats strangers, because its lack of hospitality towards the strangers. So that's also another interesting thing. But so contribute to the needs of the saints. Extend hospitality to the stranger. Bless those who persecute you. Back to that. That's back to the Sermon on the Mount, the Beatitudes. Bless and do not curse them. Rejoice with those who rejoice. Weep with those who weep. Live in harmony with one another. Do not be haughtily. I don't know, I'm not pronouncing that right, but Don't be a jerk. Do not claim to be wiser than you are. That's why often I like to read from these books rather than be like, I was thinking the other day. Do not claim to be wiser than you are. Do not repay anyone evil for evil, but take thought for what is noble in the sight of all. If it is possible, so far as it is dependent on you, live peaceable with all. Beloved, never avenge yourself, but leave room for the wrath of God. For it is written, vengeance is mine, I will pay, saith the Lord. No, if your enemy are hungry, feed them. If they are thirsty, give them something to drink. For by doing this, you will be heaping burning coals on their heads. See, there's a little bit of revenge there for you, for those folks who still need it. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. And I think about people like John Hume, who continuously worked with a divided group to the point where even his own folks turned against him at times. But him and people like MLK, they just continued to move forward and loving others and loving their enemies, and not being overcome by evil or overcome by hate. King always said, don't let anybody pull you down low enough to make you hate them, to hate. He also said something, and I'm just paraphrasing here, it's like, if you have the power to get revenge, if you have the power to take an enemy down, don't do it. Show grace, show mercy. And it's wild to me sometimes, I think, when I spend so much time online, probably too much time, as most of us. But sometimes watching the reactions of my brothers and sisters, my fellow followers of Jesus, who seem to be so hungry for vengeance and so hungry for violence and so hungry for retaliation, and so angry, and we often we have Jesus saying, don't repay evil, don't get revenge, don't do these things to one another. We have Paul, we have, it seems to be this consistent message with us to take this road that's less traveled. Even my, not to just harp on my conservative brothers and sisters, but also, I've said before, my progressive brothers and sisters often will just, make fun of evangelicals and talk down about them and, and not want to work and sit with them. One of the really cool things that happened to me last week is I did an interview with an conservative evangelical Christian show. And it was interesting to see the feedback I got on just talking about that. But that's neither here. But they said, we want to talk to you because we've heard you speaking about disagreeing well. We've heard you speaking about not scapegoating others. And we think we need that as well. And would you come on and talk about that? So that's all we really got to talk. I mean, I put a few things in there where I was like, hey, I don't think these are things that we're probably not going to ever be able to, disagree, that we're probably going to have to come to an understanding when it comes to our LGBTQ brothers and sisters and things like that. But we still talked about this situation, and it was respectful. I was heard. We listened. We talked. I don't even feel like there was ever really a tense moment, interestingly enough. And the host really felt like he was someone who was just hungry for truth, hungry for how do we love each other more? How do we learn to treat each other as human beings rather than, these identity politics of, well, they're conservative or they're this or they're that, and these people are, progressives and liberals. And why? How do we keep that from dividing us? How do we sit down? And so that first starts with us recognizing each other's humanity. And that's often really tough, especially when you don't feel like they've recognized your humanity. And this is a small step. I had a few people tell me I was being gaslit and things like that. I was like, okay, whatever. I was surprised they weren't telling me I was doing the gaslighting on that one. I heard what they had to say, but it was really wild because actually there were people that were way more along on my lines of leftist thinking and things like that, but they just didn't have room for the other anymore. And I think they were just, probably just tired and hurt and at that place where they're at. And we have to be aware of that, and we have to work with folks like that and help healing happen with folks who are going through that, and those aren't going to be the people that you send down right away to go argue this message. This is the things that we have to talk to each other about as well, of how can we do this in a productive way. And, I'm not saying sell ourselves short, not to sell out our ideas, but to at least be able to disagree and recognize each other's as humans. I would say even go as far as recognize each other's brothers and sisters in Christ. Some people aren't ready to go that far, but I think it's important. Now, I'm not going to jump too much into 13, but 8 and 10, one of my favorites is, owe no one anything except to love one another. This is 13, 8 through 10. Owe anyone except to love one another. For the one who loves another has fulfilled the law. The commandments, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not murder, you shall not steal, you shall not covet, and any other commandments are summed up in this word, love your neighbor as yourself. Love does no wrong to its neighbor. Therefore, love is fulfilling the law. So once again, we have this very clear Christian message, a message of Christ of, okay, no more reasons to look at Paul and embrace Paul. I mean, these are the type of things that I read when I was 20, and it made me feel like, oh, I'm accepted by something. I'm accepted by something greater than myself. I don't need to hate myself. I don't need to live within constant guilt. I used to think God hated me because I was surrounded by a lot of Christian teachers who were like, it's all about, sin management, and I didn't even, what sin depended on what the denomination was and what was, all these different things. It became about morality rather than faith and hope and love. It just became like, don't do them, do's and don'ts. And I felt like I could never add up to that. And the great thing was, is I realized I didn't have to. And that's where love and grace comes in. And grace is very transformative. But it's hard to put into words how transformative it is. In some ways, you just have to experience it yourself. So that's that. I did read 8 and 10 because I wanted to, but love one another. Another teaching in Romans from Paul is 14, 1 through 10. Welcome those who are weak in faith. And so this is an important one to me because I think so often when we see a lot of angry people or hurt people, their faith isn't always the strongest. Sometimes their faith is based on like a very literal reading of the Bible, almost a 6th grade understanding. And it's what they were raised with, and so their idea is like, it's like the people who would not eat food to sacrifice animals or things like that, just everything, like, they were raised more like I was, and the symbols of God were, don't do that, don't look at that, don't think of that, and so they have this weak faith, and so they're going, you can't, they're like policing you in a way, because they think that's what the right thing to do is. And Paul isn't saying like, well, just get rid of them and do, and get rid of them, tell them they're bad, and call it deconstruction. He doesn't say that. He says, welcome those who are weak in faith. And so sometimes you have to see that and maybe not say it, and sometimes you might have to say it. But the thing is to realize like this is really a faith of inclusion and bringing people together in solving issues and not biting and devouring one another. It's a reunion. It's a constant reunion. Just like it talks about how the Gentiles were grafted into the tree, it's all bringing people together. But not for the purpose of quarrels over opinion. What does it say? Welcome those who are walk in faith, but not for the purpose of quarrels over opinions. I would say quarrel will. That's why I've gone more from arguing well to disagreeing well, that maybe we can, that might be a little bit better. And eventually, I think with my friends, I can argue well. And it goes on to say, some believe eating anything while the weak eat only vegetables. Those who eat must not despise those who abstain, and those who abstain must not pass judgment on those who eat. And these were huge deals when this was written, where this is being read. These are huge deals, just like the kind of the huge deals we all have now. They don't seem to make that, like, I can't even believe that's a big deal, because it's just not where we're at. For God has welcomed them. Who are you to pass judgment on servants of another? Yikes. We're good at passing judgment, though, Paul. I know we thought you wanted us to judge people, but I guess you don't. And I guess Jesus doesn't want us either to, wow, okay. It is before their own Lord that they stand or fail, and they will be upheld, for the Lord is able to make them stand. Some judge day are better than another, while others judge all days to be alike. Let us all be fully convinced in their own minds. Those who observe the days observe it in honor of the Lord. Also those who eat in honor of the Lord, since they gave thanks to God, while those who abstain in honor of the Lord, and give thanks to God. We do not live to ourselves. This is another really interesting thing about Paul. Is, we live in a culture where we're so focused on the individual. And one of the things I think really interesting in this Gary Willis book is he argues that, Paul was thinking about the people. He wasn't thinking about individual people, like this person and that person and this person. He's like all the Greeks, all the Gentiles, all the slaves, all the free, all the men, all the women. That it was like he was thinking people, groups. This is where my faith and inclusion comes in, not just Bill and John and Jody and James and whatever. So we do not live to ourselves, and we do not die to ourselves. If we live with the Lord, and we die with the Lord. So then whether we live or whether we die, we are with the Lord. For to the ends of Christ died and lived again, so that we might be Lord of both the dead and the living. Why do you pass judgment on your brothers and sisters? Or why do you despise your brother and sister? For we will stand before the judgment seat of God, for it is written. So I think that's worth a look at. And I think it also constantly asks, when we're disagreeing, to ask ourselves, am I making a judgment statement here, or am I disagreeing? And when I'm disagreeing, am I listening to the point where I'm open to be wrong, where I'm open to have missed the point? And when I'm talking, am I defending this well, but am I defending it with compassion as well? Another place where Paul says, be ready to give an answer, but make sure you give that answer with compassion and mercy. So this is me being part of that welcome, reclaiming the Paulinian letters, these Paulinian letters that are genuine for us to take a look at. And I would really hope a lot of my progressive brothers and sisters would see that, because I think often when we miss out on Paul, we miss things that are closer to the life of Christ and messages that might be a little bit less messed with. But also, grace, Paul was really good at understanding grace. And you could tell it was something he thought on regularly and talked about regularly. And my hope is that people say, oh, you're so hard on progressives. And I am progressive. I am on the left. I mean, I'm a leftist, but still I'm on that area of that wing of that bird. And so when I talk about that, it's because I'm trying to focus on my own side. It's very easy for us to judge others. And that's often what happens with scapegoating, is if I sat around and said, I can tell you all the horrible things that happened to me when I was a kid, and what I saw the conservative church do, and what it looked like behind the scenes, and all these things. And I have in the past, and I probably will again. But not to the point where I'm constantly scapegoating them for everything. What I'm trying to do is look at my side of the street, one of the things I learned in the 12-step program, in my community that I'm mostly with, and going, how can we better ourselves before we can even start to have these conversations with other folks? Like, if we're constantly making fun of them and saying bad things, we're not going to be peacemakers. We're not going to have a bridge. No one's going to want to walk over that bridge. You don't go over there, you're going to get made fun of. You go over there, they're going to make fun of you and tell you you're going to hell. You got all this stuff. And so I'm trying to hold people that are in my, I don't really like the word tribe, but that's what I'm going to say for now to make it easier. More to think heavier, to be more accountable to how we treat one another, how we talk to one another. And I have argued with conservatives a lot. I just had some arguments with them recently. And I had to step back and go, wait, am I trying to prove a point here, or am I trying to disagree well? And so I had to rethink how I was having these conversations. Even now, I've been talking about this for years, and even now I have to remind myself, think of this differently. Or if I'm disagreeing with someone who been in the same world together, which was just recently happened too. I was able to at least be clear with them and say, hey, I'm getting angry, and I don't think I'm going to say things that are good. I don't think I'm making good points now. I feel like I might just be angry, so I'm going to step away for a few hours. But can we continue this conversation later? And they said, of course we can. So these are things to do. It's not it's progress, folks. It's not perfection. And that's the thing. And so we can't even really try not to hold each other to perfection either. I think that's what the thing we do is we just create all these standards, and crush these people with impossible standards. I'm like, they don't read the same things we're reading. They've been told that scholarship is bad, and we're reading tons of scholarship. So of course we know this, but they've been told only apologetics is okay. So where do we start with the conversation? We automatically come in and go, the scholar, and then go, oh, scholarship, smallership. I've actually had that said to me before, and so we have to sit down and reason about these things. Why is this important? Why is history important? Why understanding customs is important? Why reading the Bible within its context is vital? Why knowing why it's just a collection of writings and not some magical book? But these are hard conversations. I mean, you're sitting down going like, I get this all the time because I'm like, well, I don't accept the pastoral epistles. Some of my friends on the left don't feel comfortable with that, much less some of my conservative brothers and sisters. So when they're having that conversation, I've got to be ready to give an answer and be gentle about it. And one of the things I've been doing lately is also being very clear about, hey, when I first understood this, it shook me to the core. When I was reading this, it made me nervous because it made me think, oh, is God not in control? But guess what happened to me is that the book became even more valuable to me. The Bible became even better news to me, and I felt more, Paul is more consistent. Christ's message is more consistent. This book is now, I recently had some of my friends who are more philosophy and thinkers and theologians be like, man, you still read the Bible a lot, don't you? I'm like, yeah, but it's because to me over time, it just continues to become better news. I mean, it's good news and becomes great news, becomes fantastic news, and it becomes this thing that really interests me. And something that I don't recognize often in churches and outside and other believers and things like that. Now, I'm not saying, because I'm so perfect. No, it's just the things I'm studying going like, but we aren't going to have, this isn't going to be out there. We're not going to be doing this unless someone preaches about it, unless somebody talks about it, unless we're having conversations about it, unless we're preaching and writing books, so on and so forth. And knowing where to get these books. That's why I'm always like, hey, I read this book, check it out, please, let your friends know about it. You might hate it, but just look at it, give it a run, get that stuff going on in your mind. Because it's important, that's how we grow. Sorry, I'm talking so fast. This is a little longer talk than I expected it to be. So I will end here. I will end here with Romans 15, folks. Yeah, of course. I've got lots of different books we can share. For those listening to a podcast, I just answered a question on Facebook Live. So that's why if I say things out of the blue, you're like, what is wrong with that guy? 12, 13, 14, 15. Look at this. We're in order here. 15, 1 through 6. Galatians 15. Galatians. Freudian slip there. Romans 15, 1 through 6. We may do a whole study through Romans, but the fact that it took us like 16 weeks to go through Galatians makes me a little bit nervous about doing Romans when it's only, 6 chapters and Romans is like 16 chapters. But maybe we could do it. Maybe we could do it on a high speed thing. I'm sure we'd have a lot of people listening for part 1. 15 says, we who are strong ought to put up with the failing of the weak and not to please ourselves. Now this hit me so hard that this is actually what inspired this whole talk, was this verse. I totally forgot about it, that this inspired it because I started reading the What Paul Meant book. But this one really got me and really convicted me. And I'm really trying, I honestly, I don't do any of this stuff perfect. Like I really like arguing and disagreeing well. I promise you it's progress, not perfection, because I don't have a corner on it. I'm reminded daily that I don't have a corner on it, but I am trying to work on it, and I talk to different people. Let iron sharpen iron, as we used to say back in the old AG days, but I still believe in that concept of asking these questions. It was really philosophy that made me realize that I was doing so much scapegoating in my own life of one group of people, and that was one group of Christians. So I was practicing. I saw this guy who does these interviews, and I put it up on the thing, but he goes, when you don't give grace, when one denomination doesn't give grace to the other denomination, it's called gracism. And he's like, because you're refusing to give grace to those people. And here at Revolution, we always say grace is anarchy, because it always is for anybody. Like any system, like, I shouldn't be for that system. And the anarchy comes and goes, it is. And you're like, oh, but I don't want it to be. But that's how grace works. You are accepted. Everyone is accepted. That's why the work of this revolution, whatever it is finding unity in diversity, because all are accepted. And that's a tough thing to take, because we always want to us and them. We always want to have another. We always want to other somebody. It's not an easy road to toll. But this idea of we who are strong ought to not put up, we who are strong ought, not. See, even a Freudian reading of that. We who are strong ought to put up with the failings of the weak. It's unfortunately that the church, Christianity, has really been known as the only army that kills its wounded. We often see legalism and fear of scholarship and things like that. We don't realize that sometimes these folks are just nervous and afraid that they are failing and that they're not as strong as they say they are. When they've been told all this stuff, and they're having to toe a line that now they don't know if they can toe when they're in a conversation with someone who may have more knowledge of this than they. But it says, we who are strong ought to put up with the failings of the weak, and not to please ourselves. Each of us must please our neighbor for their good purpose of building up the neighbor. And for me, sometimes this is disagreeing well. Maybe when it's talking about, like, why should we believe in peace? Why should we be anti-war? Why should we be nonviolent? And having those conversations, but trying to stay within that moment of, my love never gives up, never loses faith, always hopeful, endures through every circumstance. So sometimes this is a hard road to walk when you're a teacher, when you're really trying to teach people these things and you want people to accept them. But it's saying, okay, step back. Their disagreement with me is not the end of the world. It's also not my job to set every single person online straight. The best I can do is teach well and try to just have disagree well. Those are the best things I can do, and do my best to love everybody and continue to work to a place where we can all come together as human beings. I mean, the church is shrinking so fast that we're all going to end up in one room together going like, oh, what do we do now? We've been fighting so long, we don't even know how to get along. Each of us must please our neighbor for good purpose of building up thy neighbor. For Christ did not please himself, but as it is written, the insults of those who insult you have fallen on me. For whatever was written in former days was written for our instruction, so that by steadfastness and by the encouragement of the Scripture, which he's talking about, the Old Testament here, because he doesn't realize he's going to be Scripture one day, we might have hope. May the God of the steadfastness and the encouragement grant you to live in harmony with one another and in accordance with Christ Jesus, so that together you may with one voice glorify God the Father of our Lord Jesus Christ. That's that allow the failing of the weak is pretty heavy stuff. So maybe that'll help us a little bit deal with when we're having disagreements and someone's saying, well, you're going to go to hell, or you have some sort of diabolical, motive here by telling me this, and that you just don't allow their anger or their hurt or their fear to be something that cuts you off from still trying to, one, love them with enlightenment, but two, that you don't let that hate or anger get the best of you, and that you're willing to say, hey, I'm going to count to 10. Hey, I'm going to say, hey, can we come back and have this conversation later? Can we talk more about this? Or, hey, let me recommend this book I read. Let me know what you think. And you tell you what, it's really hard online, but if we're doing this in person, and a lot of us have people in our lives like this, we can really grow together in a beautiful way and be an example of light and grace, and be an example of what building unity through diversity means. And saying like, hey, if we can work out our differences here, imagine how we can work out our differences in other areas of our lives. So I feel like the nonviolence kind of social justice ideal is, not just for the poor and not just for those who are being affected by war and for those, but sometimes we have to work within social justice with each other so we can do greater good for each other, so we can get more help, so we can help people, so we can live even politically, so that we can have jobs that we get paid and people can eat. I don't want to see my enemy starve, I don't want to see my enemy go into bankruptcy because they can't afford medication or the doctor's office. I want to see everybody be able to have that. And to be honest with you, if a lot of those burdens were taken off of us, these conversations might even seem a little bit easier, but we seem to confuse the two together of like the right to everybody to have a life worth living and helping them with our religion. And our religion is really should be to encourage everybody to be able to live life well. But anyway, there you go. I can't cover everything in one talk, but I hope you enjoyed the conversation today. I hope you enjoyed the talk today. And I'll recommend this book one more time so you can see it. And it's What Paul Meant by Gary Willis. So there you go. Thanks, everybody. And have a great week. Oh, I almost forgot. I start doing painting tomorrow. So I found some more part-time work. So I will be painting indoors. Hopefully that'll be something that happens more normal, but I'm going to be doing some painting, so that's good. A little more money there, which reminds me, I got to remember, Revolution needs your support. How do we get your support? You can donate to Revolution financially through revolutionchurch.com. We have Venmo and we have PayPal. If you'd like to donate with a letter or a check or things like that, you can DM me on Instagram is probably the best place to get me. You can DM me on the Revolution page or the Jay Baker page and say, hey, Jay, what's an address I can send this to? And I can give you the address. And that really helps. Financially, we've been on the edge for like 2 years, to be honest with you. And this is our 30 years. I mean, we've been here for 30 years doing this, so it's not like we're just a flash in the pan cool thing. It's just 30 years of this work that I'm proud to be a part of, and people's lives and so many different evolution over time has been really incredible to be part of. But yeah, revolutionchurch.com is tax deductible donation, so you can get that out of it, and that really helps us. Also, liking and subscribing to our channel really helps us as well. And sharing this stuff on Instagram and on Facebook and Threads and Twitter, and sharing this with your friends and letting people know about us also can be a big help, because we'd always rather have you than your money. But if you're in a place where you could financially help support this work and continue this work, I would be grateful, really grateful, because I can't. This is your stuff. You pay me. You make this church possible. This is your church, and I work for you. So thank you, everybody, so much for your love and your support. And see you next Sunday. Bye.
Thanks for listening. We hope you enjoyed this podcast. To make your 100% tax-deductible donation today, please visit revolutionchurch.com/donate. You can also learn more by clicking the donate section on the website.